Richard Mattis, Distinguished Professor of Nutrition Science at Purdue University. There's no question that overweight and obesity are major public health problems, and that diet is the driving force behind that. So there's been a good deal of interest in finding dietary manipulations to help correct the problem. Things from the composition of foods to when and how often we eat them. And the most recent iteration has been this idea that it has more to do with how much they're processed rather than their nutrient composition or how we choose to eat them. So it's just one more in a series of attempts to find a way to manage diet to help correct this public health problem. Yeah, I'm really concerned about the idea of labeling foods in general, because it leads to a belief that there are good foods and bad foods. And my view is that all foods can be incorporated into a diet. It's just how frequently and how much that we consume. The analogy I like to use is what causes traffic accidents, automobiles or drivers, right? It's how we use the foods that becomes the issue, not the foods themselves. So there are problems with eliminating what have been called ultra-processed foods, in that there are segments of the population that are highly dependent on them. These foods contribute a lot of shortfall nutrients. And so if they were eliminated from the diet, people with limited means would be disproportionately impacted by this. About a third of families in the United States are single-parent families. Convenience is not a negative attribute of foods. It is an essential component that allows families to do all of the other things they have to do while still meeting their nutrient requirements. If you eliminate these foods, you would disproportionately disadvantage, say, single-family homes. So there are real ethical issues. And if you take these foods out, any food that contains a preservative is called ultra-processed. If you take preservatives out of foods, you're going to increase the risk of food-borne illness. So there are some very real, some very tangible negative consequences of eliminating these foods. And I think before we make broad stroke dietary recommendations to restrict their use, we have to understand fully what the implications of that would be. We have historic examples of making dietary recommendations based on incomplete knowledge, and finding that because we didn't understand the underlying mechanism, our solution was not effective. And one of the examples that is clearest is several decades ago, we were certain that fat was the driver of overweight and obesity. And so the food industry responded to great demand for reduced fat products. There was a low-fat version of a very wide array of foods in the marketplace. But as consumers switched to those foods, obesity rates continued to rise. That's because it was not actually the mechanism that was responsible. And we are at a place with ultra-processed foods now that we don't understand the mechanisms. We haven't established that there's a causal relationship between consumption of these foods and adverse health outcomes like obesity. And so it's premature to make broad dietary recommendations at this time. Yeah, ideally, to set dietary guidelines, you'd like to have three lines of evidence come together. One is epidemiologic evidence. That's evidence that surveys the population, says there is an association here, a relationship between consumption of some kinds of foods and an adverse health outcome. And in addition, there are some segments of the population that may be particularly at risk. So that helps to define the problem, to pose the hypothesis. We have ample evidence that ultra-processed foods are an issue that warrants study. But what we don't have is strong evidence that there is a causal relationship. There are many things that are associated with an adverse health outcome but don't cause it. And so intervening to change something that's not responsible is not likely to have a beneficial effect. So we need more clinical trials to establish causality to move forward. And we have basically no mechanistic information. If we want to know where to intervene, how to make a change to affect body weight, we have to understand the mechanism. And at the present time, we have really no evidence of how these ultra-processed foods may be working to undermine our health.